Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Ryan Gury, CEO and co-founder of the company PDW, about the future of the drone industry and how much control humans can and should have over unmanned systems in the future. And then we break down the risks of a major India-Pakistan military clash, the apparent end of the U.S. bombing campaign against the Houthis, and we've got a detailed explanation for why top U.S. officials use the commercial app Signal to communicate. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I'm joined as always by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. I am in Tampa, Florida, where I've been attending SOF Week, gathering of special operations forces and defense industry leaders from all over the world. And on this week's show, we've got some great content from SOF Week, including an in-depth interview with Ryan Gury of the leading drone company PDW about the future of unmanned systems and autonomy. But before we get to that, first things first, as always, Guy, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. It is great to be here with you on the podcast for another week. At the top of my list are the spiraling tensions between India and Pakistan, both nuclear-armed nations, and really the geopolitical and security implications from this that reach to China, Russia, and the United States. India carried out a wave of missile strikes on targets inside Pakistan on May 7, Ben. This has put the world on edge, and it's ratcheted tensions between New Delhi and Islamabad to levels not seen since 2019, when they teetered at that time on the edge of war for a little bit, but managed to diffuse the situation. All of this ties to friction over Kashmir, a restive territory that India and Pakistan have had disputed claims to for generations now, Ben. India said its missile strikes on May 7 were in retaliation for a terrorist attack that occurred on April 22nd in the Indian-controlled part of Kashmir, resulting in the death of 26 people. New Delhi blamed Pakistan for that attack or for harboring the individuals who carried out that attack. Going forward, Ben, as we tape this on May 8, Pakistani officials are threatening to retaliate against India. So we're watching it closely. A key note here is that China is also watching it closely. China and India have a very tense relationship of their own. It's very interesting, Ben, that Indian media reported in recent days that Indian military officials actually briefed China on the scope of the May 7 missile strikes that India carried out against Pakistan, probably to try and put China at ease, that India was not trying to escalate things with China, but this was an India-Pakistan only issue. But the Indians also alerted Beijing that Indian forces are prepared to strike again if Pakistan escalates the situation. So we're tracking it daily in the Threat Status newsletter at the Washington Times. On a separate front, Ben, we're also trying to make sense of President Trump's surprise announcement in recent days that the U.S. will halt its bombing campaign against Iran-backed Houthi militants in Yemen because, Mr. Trump claims, the group has reached out to his administration to surrender. There's not been a lot of detail behind that claim yet, Ben, and there's a lot of uncertainty around this whole development because Israel has also been carrying out a bombing campaign against the Houthis in recent days, and sources are telling Threat Status that the Trump administration actually did not notify Israel of its apparent surrender agreement with the Houthis before President Trump announced it on May 6. The Israelis were unsurprisingly miffed about this, Ben. Finally, another story that's on my radar centers on the testimony that Latin America security expert Ryan Berg, he's with the Center for Strategic and International Studies think tank, Ben, He gave to a House Homeland Security subcommittee in recent days, claiming that Chinese intelligence officials are now actively using several bases in Cuba to spy on the United States. Okay, there have been murmurings about this for years, Ben, but now it's kind of blowing into the open of the theater of congressional hearings in Washington. Our senior national security correspondent, Bill Gertz, is actually covering it pretty closely. He dove into it deeply in the May 8 version of the Threat Status Daily newsletter.
I mean, look, it's Chinese influence in this hemisphere, whether it's the Panama Canal, which has been a major priority for the Trump administration, bases in Cuba. There's a lot here, and it's something we're going to obviously keep tracking here at Threat Status. As I mentioned, I'm on the ground at Soft Week in Tampa, and so was Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. He came down here just hours after he announced a 20% across the board reduction in the number of 4-star generals and admirals in the military. He also wants a 20% reduction in the number of general officers in the National Guard and a further 10% cut of generals in the active duty ranks, just more broadly speaking. This is a major change, and it's controversial in some quarters, but I do think it underscores that Hegseth, for whatever you think about him, and we'll talk about his use of Signal here in just a minute, but he does seem to want to tackle some big reforms inside the military. In his speech at Soft Week, he focused on some pretty bread and butter issues for him. Gender neutral standards for military services, getting rid of wokeness and weakness, as he puts it. No more dudes in dresses, drag shows on military bases, bring back troops who were, essentially kicked out because they refused the COVID-19 vaccine a few years ago, and more. But what was more interesting to me, guys, he spent time on the convention floor. And of course, there are plenty of defense companies angling, to get FaceTime with the secretary and show off their products and maybe try to get some funding. It's notable that he, made sure to stop by the booths of companies like Anduril, the defense company most famous for its drones and counter UAS systems, and other companies that until recently may have been considered, I think, kind of up-and-comers or even non-traditional players among the big primes in the defense industry. But Hegseth seems to, near as I could tell, and talking to folks down here on the ground, have his finger on the rapidly changing nature of the defense industry that we've talked a lot about on this podcast over the past almost year and a half now. So that really jumped out to me, that it seems like he kind of understands where the defense industry is going, the companies that are sort of on the way up, the trajectory is on the way up, and he made sure to single a lot of those out in the brief time that he was on the ground on the convention floor. Now, speaking of Hegseth, listeners may remember that a few weeks ago, Guy and I talked at length on this show about why federal officials might be using Signal, the commercially available app. This, of course, comes from the now infamous Signal group chat in which Hegseth, Vice President Vance, Secretary of State Rubio, and others were discussing details of U.S. strikes against the Houthis, and Atlantic editor Jeffrey Goldberg was accidentally added to that group. Now, how on earth could that happen? Don't Hegseth, Vance, Rubio, and others have a secure way to talk, a way in which it would have been impossible for a journalist to accidentally get included? I talked to Jared Shepard about this here at Softweek. Jared is an Army veteran and the CEO of Hypori, a company that says its products allow U.S. troops and other personnel to use their own personal devices as a fully secure window to access sensitive information stored in the cloud. None of that sensitive data is on their own devices. This is known as BYOD, or bring your own device. I asked Jared what he made of the Signal group chat and whether Signal, generally speaking, is a secure platform, and why it is in 2025 the government doesn't have a fully secure way for top officials to talk. And here's what Jared had to say.
This is the paradigm that we always run into, right? Is the more secure it is, the harder it is to use, the less likely people are going to use it. And so when you make something that's really easily available, like Signal, which is relatively secure, right? And you make that easily available, then people tend to use what's easily available. Right. And especially in a platform that's publicly available like Signal, that means you can bring in multiple people, multiple agencies, multiple organizations, and you can all collaborate on one environment. Now, of course, that was what backfired, was they accidentally brought somebody in that shouldn't have been in that environment. And that's, that's the problem when you don't have a proverbial walled garden where you can't protect who is allowed to have and who isn't allowed to have information.
What's the definition, as you see it, as somebody who's just, waist deep in this stuff every day of your life now? of a secure platform? You said Signal's relatively secure.
Sure.
What's in your mind is the definition of what a relatively secure platform is?
There are some challenges when you talk about security, right? And especially with the government, with the Department of Defense, and with others, because there are policies, regulations, and laws in place that will define some portions of that security. Some of those are like, for instance, auditability. There is a Records Retention Act out there that requires that anything that is used in an official capacity in the government must be able to be audited, right? So you have to be able to go back and say, hey, did so-and-so send a message at this time, or did so-and-so receive this message at this time? And so you have to be able to audit that. Signal is what's called a public-private key infrastructure environment, which means I have a key, you have a key. Our two keys together mean that's how we communicate with each other, but it can't be independently audited or monitored. So it's ephemeral in nature, which means that it's designed to destroy itself over time. So while that offers you a level of security, it also prevents you from auditing it or controlling it or ensuring delivery and some of these other things that are required in the federal government.
Yeah. One last thing on Signal, because my co-host Guy Taylor and I talked about this a few weeks ago. We were kind of dumbfounded this idea that how is there not a secure messaging platform for public officials, military officials, intelligence folks? Like, how is that not already there? We're 10 years since the Hillary Clinton email scandal now, and we're still talking about this stuff. How is it that doesn't exist, or does it, and it's just not being used?
We can be a solution for that, right? We are a solution for that within the Department of Defense, for BYOD, where we allow service members to have access to NIPRNet, which is the CUI unclassified network of the Department of Defense, from their personal cell phone. That kind of a thing we would have protected against, because you can't accidentally add someone into that environment that isn't already accredited to be into that environment. That doesn't solve the whole problem, especially if you're trying to do multi-agency across multiple agencies. That's a complex problem, and like, who gets to validate who gets in,
right,
based on what kind of identification? Who manages the identity management solution that allows that to work across all these different agencies or contributing organizations, etc. So, I mean, while it sounds like, hey, this is just like bottled water, this just makes sense, why hasn't somebody already done this?
Right.
It's actually more complex than that.
I mean, there we go, guy. I mean, I think Jared did a pretty good job of laying it out. We often forget a pretty basic concept that's at play here with all this stuff, and that's that some of these government officials are people our age, maybe a bit older, but they want to use their phones and messaging apps that are familiar and comfortable to them. And sometimes it's partly just that simple. I remember covering, the ongoing fight in the Obama administration about whether former President Barack Obama could keep using his personal BlackBerry. But there is something else he said there that gets at the heart of the question we asked a couple of weeks ago, which is why they're using Signal at all. It sounds like the answer is because it's easy to make a group chat with officials from multiple agencies on Signal. Jared Shepard said that you could, from a technical perspective, have an app that's fully secure where there is significant vetting and multi-layer security checks for who gets added to the group. But who's actually going to oversee that and implement it? The CIA, the FBI? Do we need some kind of communications czar or a secretary of secure messaging? I'm kind of half joking, Guy, but from what Jared says, it seems like you'd need almost a memo from the White House or for the Office of Personnel Management, maybe with the endorsement of the Secret Service, to lay out how each agency should do this and someone to oversee it and make sure it's being implemented properly with all the proper security protocols in place. So it is a pretty complicated issue at its core, I think.
No question, Ben. And I think you raise a lot of really good questions. And my view is really that this whole imbroglio, every time I use that word, a listener contacts me after the podcast to point out it's such a fun word. But the whole imbroglio over this Signal chat and secured comms and secured mobile comms, I think it's going to continue. It's notable that Senator Ron Wyden, Oregon Democrat, has written to the Justice Department in recent days requesting that DOJ probe counterintelligence risks posed by White House personnel who reportedly have used something called telemessage, which is a tool to archive encrypted chats on the Signal messaging platform. So, yes, I think there needs to be government attention here to try and figure out how to create a standardized, very secure mobile comms system for high-level, politically appointed or otherwise, officials who have a certain clearance level.
And we're joined now by Ryan Gury. He is the CEO and co-founder of PDW, and we are speaking inside the PDW trailer outside the Tampa Convention Center here at Soft Week. Ryan, thanks so much for coming on the Threat Status Podcast.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me.
Walk me through the history of PDW, which is pretty interesting. You all started out building performance racing drones, is that right?
Yeah, so we started off as a TV show. We were live on ESPN, NBC, and Sky Sports, more or less trying to develop a future sport that people would, be interested in, and we would attract sponsorship dollars. In order to manifest that vision, we had to develop a lot of industrial robotics from scratch to facilitate the sport. So, we'd have 500 drones that would get destroyed per event. We'd have to fly multi-miles inside arenas and use software-based radio systems to avoid interference and jamming. And within a few years of doing this and being public about it, we started attracting SOF forces for training, and we ran into our CTO, Dylan Ham, who's a SEAL, and was delivering missions with small drones as part of his effort, right? So we realized there was an opportunity to develop equipment in the space where no one else was developing equipment, and also an emerging market that would disrupt a lot of the defense primes and initiatives currently working on strategic assets, right? And we can see a lot of that happening with the war in Ukraine, where commercial tech and small drones represent 90 to 95% of the personnel and armor destroyed in that ground war. And, this is something that we saw coming for some time, but wasn't really a global narrative until this ground war.
Yeah. It's interesting. You mentioned kind of, disrupting with the primes, and is that just kind of where we are in the national security and defense spaces right now, where it's, companies that maybe are a little, sort of outside the box, if you will, so isn't necessarily traditionally involved with DoD, that gets people's attention now?
Well, I think what is very clear is that commercial technology has matured to such a state where the Houthis can take Reapers out of the sky. I think we have, dozens down at this point.
We've lost 7 over the past 2 months or something.
Right. It's $500 million.
Right.
And, we see commercial technology in sensors, in radios. We see it in the ability to build small robotics. We see automatic target recognition modules made out of Raspberry Pis. And essentially, when you can go on Amazon and build yourself a Hellfire, right, things have changed.
Yeah.
And companies like ours are defense tech and startup tech oriented, where we're moving with vast velocity to create our products. We're leveraging, modern principles of engineering and flight testing. But I think essentially what puts PDW apart is that we have combat veterans leading our engineering department. So Dylan Ham, like I mentioned, he was a prior SEAL. He manages the entire engineering org, the backlog, every requirement and thing that we do. Ray Poloni is a famous war hero of Roberts Ridge and comes from Army Tier 1, manages our R&D team. Chuck McGraw, also a SEAL, highly deployed and just amazing. He manages our customer relations. And I think it's very hard to develop products in this space. The users are incredibly finicky. There's a lot of nebulous tech in the world. And, we can deliver products to an operator that were designed from an operator, right? So I think PDW converges into a lot of different areas where we're capitalizing on the speed and maturity of commercial tech, the rapidization of startup methodologies and fast agile movement, and ultimately, leveraging combat veterans at the tip of our product development and engineering pipeline, right? And we get to come in and offer this incredible, edge of, low-cost systems that evolve with the warfighter one-to-one, and we can meet, bleeding-edge requirements because we're moving at such speed. And I think that's where the juxtaposition comes with, these primes that were basically made to make strategic assets, right? Where, requirements and engineering cycles would last for years, right? We're the opposite of the F-35. We're making combat systems that cost between $5,000 to $10,000, right? That are up against the same performance metrics of the Switchblade, which costs, $500,000? It's crazy. And I think that's the type of disruption that American defense is about to see, where attrition and scale is important, and being able to design and manufacture combat systems that can be quickly, built and designed and manufactured, right? Because this is the end of the era of strategic assets. And we need to ensure that American warfighters are leading lethality with scalable systems that are very inexpensive, where single units can have access to these systems and they can be indispensable. So we look at our robotic systems the same way you look at a 155 round, right? It should cost the same, and it should compete with the strategic assets that we see like Andurils and AeroVironment's currently making.
It's interesting. Stu Braden made a similar point on the podcast last week. We talked about if you mass a huge force, ground forces, major strategic assets, whether it's aircraft, large drones, or ground vehicles, anywhere in the world, you can annihilate it in today's environment.
Right.
So that's just no longer a viable concept for the U.S. military.
The scale and disruption of what's happening with these small units essentially allows an infantry unit to deploy their own air support, right? So they're calling in fires, they're doing resupplies. The front line in Ukraine is all robotic at this point. And I think that's where warfare will evolve, right? But it's the most important factor of that is that your systems can be scaled and deployed to everyone. You have to look at robotics the same way you look at munitions. One-time use, attritable. If it goes down, grab another. Yeah. And I think that is the sentiment that we believe in and will help drive American doctrine forward.
A best performing, most versatile drone today.
Yes.
What does that look like? What does it have to be able to do today?
So we have a mothership product that's been out in the market for about a year and a half, and we've been down selected alongside Anduril in a very big program of record called Medium Range Reconnaissance. That requirement was written by General Rainey and issued by General George as transformation in contact, which is an entirely new procurement method for the Army. So it's made to get equipment to end units fast and get the feedback back from them fast. So we're sending out equipment and seeing feedback within a couple months. In order for us to win this contract, we beat out 40 other competitors throughout the world. And, we're currently Anduril's Ghost's largest competitor. We're about a fraction of the price, and we're very excited to see the results and compete with them. A mothership is used in Ukraine for a variety of different missions. So you can use it for long-range ISR. You can use it for precision fires with a laser target designator for ordnance delivery, right? So it's a multi-mission asset, comes out of a rucksack for a soldier, and allows them to essentially deploy their own air support, right? And I think that's the very beginnings of our portfolio of products that we'll be developing in this space for single units and for mass distribution.
So obviously easy to use, small learning curve. Somebody's going to pull something out of the rucksack.
Absolutely. Yeah. We develop a simulator that goes alongside of it, works on the controller, but I think ease of use, tactical deployment, a variety of other requirements that must meet the Army. But yeah, I think the mothership, a 5, 10 pound, 25 pound mothership will be a classification of drone that'll last for many decades. The same way that you look at mortars or small arms, right? There's going to be a pistol, a rifle, a machine gun. The same way will happen with drones. There's going to be, a one-way attributable quadcopter, an FPV that you see in Ukraine. There's going to be motherships, and these will last for years, right? And we're helping to define these categories and lead in these spaces that we believe will be pillars of ground war defense for decades to come.
What do you think? What is the U.S. lead in this space right now? Is it being eroded by China, for example, or are we still significant ways ahead where they are with this kind of stuff?
Well, it's important to note that the first strike in Ukrainian ground war against armor was like 20 and 24 months ago. Everything that we've known about defense has changed since then, right? And the tactics and the way that we use robotics, it now represents 90 to 95% of the kills in that ground war, right? I think the Army's done an incredible job in that transformational model. And I think initiatives like Transformation in Contact and MRR are representative of that. I already have, hundreds of assets downrange and getting feedback to make them better, right? And these are much more lethal than what you see, typically used in the ground war in Ukraine. And they also meet the requirements of Americans for safety and arming munitions, and encryption and security. So what's happening in Ukraine, I think, is a great crucible to understand certain tactics, what's working. But a lot of the systems that they're building would never meet our requirements in terms of safety and security. So we have to kind of upgrade them all and ensure that they're more effective and safe to use.
But operating in different kinds of environments. You mentioned Ukraine. That's a very different environment than, say, a war in the Pacific or, combating the Gaza Strip, for example. So what you're manufacturing can be used in any of those wartime environments.
We were just in Norway with the Arctic Strike. We're in 9 Mile in Texas. We're in the Middle East, so we hear a lot of dual use, being thrown around. Mm-hmm. I think it's important to note that, like, if you're going to be in dual use, designing for defense requirements is much harder than for commercial requirements, right? So for us, we're looking at the BOM and source selection. We're making sure the environmentals and testing against that, our wind tolerance, our acoustic tolerance, our hot and cold temperatures, like, that's par for the course, right? You also have to design it so it can scale. You also have to design it so that you can deliver it cheaper and as effective as all these other systems we see across the world, right? So, like, there's a lot of change occurring, and we're here to capitalize on that change.
I'm curious where you come down in this the human in the loop idea when it comes to operating things like this, especially now with the advent of AI involved in all of this stuff. I mean, is this something, to what degree does the individual soldier or special operator control every aspect of what this thing is going to do, or do you give it a mission and it kind of goes out and does its own thing? To what degree do you see the humans continuing to be in the loop, so to speak, for lack of a better term?
AI is a huge word. And I think for now, the Americans and the State Department always essentially have a human in a loop, of course, during, missions and strike missions and lethal missions. But what we're seeing in Ukraine and Russia is, the evolution of ATR and terminal guidance, where drones are set out to survey a piece of land. They're looking at that land for targets. They're, assessing whether that target is a friend or foe, and then they're striking that target automatically, right? And that's already getting done with commercial technology that you can buy off of Amazon. These are Raspberry Pis and small, F7s. Like, the cat's out of the bag, right? So we see warfare, evolving, especially with our adversaries already executing this, where terminal guidance and automatic target recognition is going to be par for the course, right? And I think we look for partners like Palantir or Turbine One or Athena, who are working really hard on those computer vision models and ensuring that our weapon systems adhere to American standards, safety, and ethics. And, we listen to the State Department. That's who ultimately controls us. But if you look across the world, these systems are deployed every day. And they're making decisions on the edge by themselves without humans in the loop.
Right.
It's just how humanity and warfare is going to evolve. And I think we have to ask questions to ourselves, like, do we want to lead or do we want to wait? And I think that's up for debate at the current time.
Yeah, no, it's funny because when I started writing about AI, a few years ago, the human in the loop idea was just so ubiquitous in every conversation. Don't worry, there's always going to be. And now it's like, that's almost just such a passé notion when you're talking about drone swarms and potentially millions of decisions being made in matters of minutes or seconds. It's physically impossible for humans to be involved at every level of that decision-making process.
Yeah, and I think that scales to other types of things we see, from AI to LMMs, how AI is going to scale, right? And it's going to have touch points in every facet of human culture and ethics. So, but that's not our job. Our job is to listen to the Pentagon and State Department and ensure that our fighters are the most lethal they can be against those standards.
Last thing, Ryan, how much of an eye do you have toward what the latest and sort of most disruptive counter UAS technology is? We wrote about the British Ministry of Defense test a couple of weeks ago using radio waves to take down drone swarms. Are you always looking at, how can we design this to make sure it's ahead of whatever the counter side is doing?
Yeah, of course. That's a cat and mouse game. We develop radio systems in partnership with SOCOM to counter electronic warfare. Our earliest efforts inside PDW were radio group turned drone group. We believe that the spectrum is highly contested, that the days of having a link to a drone are over. And if you're not developing next generation systems that are not built around compliance or the amateur radio bands like our whole industry is now, you're not going to be able to provide a link, to your drones. Already we see the front lines crisscrossed with fiber optics, to ensure packets get to the drone and not. And I think essentially the whole radio industry in the DoD is about to be disrupted as much as strategic assets, where, persistent systems and Silvus and Trellisware and are ultimately building their radio modules around small little windows in the spectrum. And they only operate in these small little windows. You can stop all that stuff with a power amplifier and an SDR from Amazon. So the days of having an open radio spectrum are over, and we should be looking toward next generation radio systems that are designed from the front to counter jamming, protocol sniffing, and Gaussian noise jamming on the front. Otherwise, we're never going to be able to have a link with our drones, and we're going to rely on fiber optics.
Right. Ryan Gury, PDW, thanks so much for joining us.
Such a pleasure, Ed. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home, domestically, or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now, this week, as you're listening to the show. Guy, what do you have for us as your Threat of the Week?
My threat of the week, Ben, centers on the soaring tensions between India and Pakistan. These are two nuclear-armed nations. Pakistan has ties to Iran and China. India, which characterizes itself as staunchly neutral, is a strategic partner of the United States and has tense relations with China, but also has relatively positive relations with Russia, Ben. The dynamics here are complicated and they're intense. My threat is that Pakistan may miscalculate and escalate things with India by launching missiles at targets inside India. And if that happens, I think India will likely escalate further. And it's unclear how China, Russia, and the United States will respond to that type of a situation. This is just a dangerous conflagration, Ben. And it's my threat of the week because I think it could blow up into a major foreign policy and global security problem for the Trump administration, whose bandwidth for these things is absorbed on a range of other fronts right now. We could talk about Ukraine. We could talk about the pursuit of Iran talks. We could talk about the trade war, tariff war with China. This is just a dangerous and somewhat surprise situation.
Yeah, as it often is in foreign policy and national security when things kind of come out of nowhere when you least expect it. Guy, my threat of the week is the sunk cost fallacy, or the the concept or feeling like you're too heavily invested financially in a project to abandon it, even though it's clearly not working. Now, specifically in this case, I'm talking about the Pentagon's recent decision to walk away from the $1 billion M10 Booker tank. Now, in some ways, there could be a silver lining here. Maybe this is even a positive development because the Army decided to give up on this project before it went into mass production. But how did we get here? The Army spent years trying to develop a lightweight tank that could be dropped out of a plane onto the battlefield. That years-long development process produced a tank that weighs 42 tons, which is not only too heavy to be dropped out of a plane, it's too heavy to go across some bridges. In other words, it's the opposite of what the Army wanted. Now, Army Secretary Daniel Driscoll told reporters this week that, quote, "We got the Booker wrong. What came out of the procurement process wasn't good," unquote. We talk a lot on this show, Guy, about acquisition reform, changes to how the Pentagon does business. This is why. Critics might say there are other examples as well where you have lengthy processes, lots of people involved, tons of money, and the end result isn't what the military needs. So again, the silver lining, as Secretary Driscoll said, is that they pulled the plug on this now rather than spend many billions of dollars more to roll off the assembly line a bunch of tanks that the Army doesn't want. So maybe things are changing. I can tell you here at Soft Week, everyone I talk to wants it to change a lot faster. But for now, it's still a threat, and that's why it's my threat of the week. And with that, a huge thanks, Guy. Thanks once again for another great week on the podcast. Big thanks to Ryan Gury from PDW and everyone here at Soft Week for making us feel so at home throughout the week in Tampa, Florida. And a big thanks to all of you, our listeners. Please go ahead, hit the subscribe button, share with all of your friends, and Guy and I will be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.